That's a big one. Easy, girl.
Coming
Easy.
on.
Oh my God. Lord, easy, girl. Hang on. Damn it.
Pull in under that loop there.
I'm trying to. Damn thing's like iron. Rope's coming around. Pull when I say.
Watch its head. Watch its head. Now pull. Pull. Just moving. Keep it up. Keep it up.
Come on, girl. Breathe. Breathe. Holy. That's a big one. Easy, girl.
I'm coming.
Easy.
Hold her. Keep its head off her shoulders.
It's got her tight. Come on, Snake. Let go.
Throwing a loop. Watch out.
Gonna hit it.
Now. It slipped. Get back.
Oh my God. Easy, girl. You're right. You're right. Hang in there. We'll get you stitched up. Damn thing's dead. Easy. Easy.
The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the bleached land until the colors surrendered, leaving only a pale haze and the thick, constant drone of insects. Under the meager shade of an equipment shed, a man moved with a quiet economy of motion, his hands methodically cleaning the tools of his trade. They were weathered hands, scarred and calloused by years of wrestling with the unpredictable will of the wild. Yet they worked with a practiced rhythm that seemed at odds with the tension coiled deep in his shoulders. The air itself felt heavy, a suffocating stillness that was more unsettling than peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath, a silent pause before the world remembers how to be violent. He knew this silence intimately. It was always the prelude, the deep inhale before nature's inevitable and often brutal exhale. A sudden gust of hot wind swirled through the clearing, kicking up a fine layer of dust that tasted of parched earth and decay. It carried the familiar scent of sun-baked grass, but underneath it, something else lingered, a foreign note in the day's oppressive symphony. It was a coppery, metallic smell, an animal scent that was raw and sharp, speaking of distress and the primal struggle for survival. The man paused, his hands stilling over a piece of steel. He lifted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once, his senses reaching out into the shimmering heat. The insects hummed on, oblivious, but the oppressive peace had been compromised. A single wrong detail had entered the landscape, and for a man like him, that was more than enough to set every nerve on high alert, a silent alarm ringing in his gut. Then the sound came, tearing through the thick, humid air with an artificial violence. A telephone shrieked from inside the nearby office, a piercing, desperate cry that shattered the monotony of the afternoon. It was a sound that did not belong here, an intrusion of human panic into a world governed by slower, more ancient rhythms. The man's body reacted before his mind, a flinch of muscle betraying the calm exterior he had cultivated over a lifetime of emergencies. He set the tool down with a soft click, the sound swallowed by the sudden urgency. The phone continued its relentless scream, each ring amplifying the wrongness he had sensed on the wind. The silent, waiting tension had finally found its voice, and it was a cry for help. He moved toward the sound, his long shadow stretching across the dusty ground, knowing the day's fragile routine had just been irrevocably broken. He listened, his expression unreadable as a voice on the other end of the line spilled out, fractured by a terror that needed no translation. The words were a torrent of fear and desperation, painting a fragmented but horrifying picture that confirmed the warning his instincts had already given him. The day was no longer his own. Before we continue, comment where you're watching this story from. I want to know how far these stories of courage travel. And if you can, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep the mission of protecting nature alive. The man's knuckles were white as he gripped the receiver, his gaze already distant, calculating the terrain, the time, the risk. The call ended, but the panic it delivered now hung in the air, a palpable presence. He turned, his movements precise and immediate. The peace was over. The hunt had begun. The old truck tore through the landscape, its engine a low growl against the oppressive quiet of the afternoon. A plume of pale dust billowed in its wake, a temporary ghost that hung in the thick, humid air before settling back onto the scorched earth. Inside the cab, the silence was as heavy as the heat. No one spoke. The men sat with their gazes fixed forward, their faces etched with a focused tension that turned the small space into a pressure cooker of anticipation. They scanned the horizon, where the heat created shimmering waves that distorted the world, making it seem unstable and unreal. The ranchers' fragmented directions echoed in their minds, a chaotic puzzle of fear that pointed them toward a place where the natural order had been violently disrupted. Every bump in the road, every sway of the vehicle was a steady beat counting down to the moment they would face whatever had broken the day's peace. The truck rolled to a stop in a wide, empty clearing, and the engine was cut. The sudden absence of sound was deafening, a vacuum that pulled at the senses. This was a place that should have been alive with the lowing of cattle, the rustle of grazing, the distant hum of ranch life. Instead, there was nothing. Only the low whistle of the wind as it moved through the tall, sun-bleached grass, a lonely and mournful sound. Then, carried on that same wind, came another noise. It was high and thin, a desperate wail that was almost lost in the vastness of the open space. It repeated in a fragile, rhythmic pattern, a sound so full of distress it felt almost human, like the cry of a lost child calling out in a place where no one could hear. The man exchanged a single hard look before stepping out into the suffocating heat. They moved forward on foot, their boots sinking slightly into the dry, cracked soil. The tall grass parted before them and whispered shut behind them, swallowing them into the landscape. The wailing grew louder, more distinct, its pitch rising with a raw and unfiltered panic that tightened the muscles in their chests. Each step was deliberate, a careful advance into an unknown confrontation. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen weight, as if the sky itself was pressing down on this one small patch of earth. They could feel the wrongness of the place in their bones, a primal instinct screaming that they were approaching a scene of profound struggle. The sun beat down on their necks, and the smell of dry earth mixed with something else, something coppery and vital. They were close now, the sound pulling them toward the heart of the disturbance. Pushing through a final curtain of tall grass, they stopped. The world seemed to fall away, the sounds of the wind and their own breathing drowned out by the sight before them. It was a tableau of impossible violence, a knot of life and death that defied comprehension. A colossal mass of iridescent scales, thick as a man's torso, was wrapped in a slow, suffocating embrace around the throat of a mother cow. Her body was already beginning to sag, her legs buckling under the immense constricting pressure of the giant reptile. The thin, desperate wail came from a few feet away, where a small, trembling calf stood frozen, watching its mother's life being squeezed away. What they saw in that sun-drenched clearing was a nightmare made real, something no amount of training or experience could have ever prepared them to witness. The sight struck them with the force of a physical blow, a silent explosion of primal violence that froze the air in their lungs. The python was a living river of muscle and scale, its iridescent skin shimmering with an almost beautiful indifference under the harsh sun. It moved with a hypnotic, deliberate slowness, each fractional tightening of its coils an act of immense and patient power. The mother cow's eyes were wide, no longer just panicked, but clouded with the dull haze of oxygen deprivation, a profound and desperate terror. Yet, even as her life was being squeezed away, her gaze remained fixed on the small, trembling calf that stood just a few feet away. Its thin, reedy cries were the only sound that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat, a heartbreaking soundtrack to a scene of unimaginable cruelty. This was not a quick, clean kill. It was a slow, agonizing spectacle of life being unmade. A cold, heavy wave of empathy washed over the men, a feeling that went beyond professional duty and touched something far more fundamental. This wasn't merely a predator taking its prey, a simple transaction in the brutal economy of the wild. It was a tableau of maternal devotion being systematically crushed by an ancient, unthinking force. The dilemma was immediate, absolute, and paralyzing. To intervene, to rush in, might cause the snake to tighten its grip in a final, fatal spasm, ending the cow's struggle in an instant. It could also turn the creature's lethal attention toward them, transforming a rescue into a fight for their own lives. But to do nothing, to stand by as witnesses while the mother suffocated in front of her child, was a moral impossibility. The air grew thick and charged, each man locked in a silent internal battle between calculated risk and raw humanity. His eyes never left the colossal reptile, scanning the immense body for any sign of weakness, any point of leverage. He could see the strain in the cow's muscles, the subtle tremor that signaled her body was beginning to fail. Time was not a luxury they possessed. With a breath so slow and controlled it was almost invisible, he took a single, deliberate step forward. The dry grass crunched under his boot, a sound that seemed to echo across the silent clearing like a gunshot. The python's head, a smooth, armored wedge, lifted slightly, its black, unblinking eyes fixing on the new movement. There was no anger in its gaze, only a cold, reptilian awareness. He raised a hand, slowly, a silent command to his team to hold their positions, to wait for his signal. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to retreat, but the sight of the calf, still crying for its mother, anchored him to the spot. He was closer now, close enough to smell the dusty, musky scent of the snake and the metallic tang of the cow's fear. He could feel the low-frequency vibration of the struggle through the soles of his boots, a deep, rhythmic thrum of life and death playing out in the baked earth. And that moment, the world shrank to this single sun-scorched patch of ground. There was no backup coming, no easy solution, no time left for strategy. There was only the raw, undeniable reality of the choice before him. He met the eyes of his men, one by one, and saw the same grim resolve reflected back at him. They were a single unit, bound by an unspoken pact. Without a word, he gave a short, sharp nod. The invisible line between caution and commitment was crossed. The silent standoff was over. The fight had begun. The world erupted into a blur of controlled chaos. The men fanned out, their movements precise and practiced, forming a loose semicircle around the struggling mass of life. The python's head snapped up, its black eyes locking on to the closing threat. A sound tore from its throat, a low, guttural hiss that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, an ancient warning that promised lethal violence. They moved in unison, a wave of human determination against a wall of reptilian power. The air, already thick with heat, now crackled with a new and volatile energy. Dust kicked up from their heavy boots, mingling with the scent of dry grass and raw fear. Every muscle was coiled tight, every sense on high alert. The first man lunged, his machete flashing in the sun, but the blade skidded off the thick, iridescent scales with a sharp, metallic screech that set everyone's teeth on edge. The fight became a primal dance of brute force and desperate strategy. The snake thrashed, its immense body a whip of pure muscle that sent shockwaves through the parched earth. The men dodged and weaved, their grunts of effort lost in the cacophony of scraping scales and the dull thud of the creature's tail slamming against the ground. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes and mixing with the pale dust that coated their skin. The sun was a merciless observer, beating down on the scene and amplifying the suffocating intensity of the struggle. They were not fighting an animal, they were fighting a force of nature, an ancient and unthinking power that refused to yield its prize. Each attempt to gain leverage, to find a weak point in the living armor, was met with a surge of resistance that threw them back, draining their strength and their hope with every passing second. Suddenly, the python's tail arced through the air with blinding speed, a thick, muscular blur that caught one of the men across the chest. He went down hard, the air driven from his lungs in a choked gasp, landing in a cloud of dust just feet from the struggle. The coordinated attack faltered, the rhythm broken by the sudden, brutal display of power. Rick's eyes darted to his fallen teammate, then back to the python, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The cow, caught in the middle of the maelstrom, let out a low, strangled sound, a gurgle of air being forced from her collapsing throat. Her legs trembled violently, the last of her strength failing her. The men's shouts became more ragged, tinged with a desperation that bordered on panic. The clearing had become a crucible, a testing ground where their courage was being measured against an opponent that did not know fear. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos, a sound that made the world stand still. It was a final, ragged exhalation from the mother cow, a soft and defeated sigh as the last of the air left her body. Her head slumped to the side, her eyes glazing over. The immense pressure from the python's coils had done its work. For a single, horrifying beat, everything stopped. The men froze, their weapons held uselessly at their sides. The snake, sensing victory, seemed to tighten its grip one last time, a final, inexorable squeeze. A profound and heavy silence descended, broken only by the thin, keening cry of the calf, a sound that now seemed to echo in a world suddenly emptied of hope. In that moment of absolute despair, it felt as though they had not just failed to save a life, but had only managed to bear witness to its agonizing end. But in that sliver of stillness, as the python focused on its final crushing act, Rick saw it. An almost imperceptible gap between two massive coils, just below the reptile's head, where a small patch of lighter-colored underbelly was exposed. It was a fleeting opportunity, a chance that would last no more than a second. Instinct took over, pushing aside the exhaustion and the despair. He let out a raw, guttural shout, a sound that was less a command and more a pure release of pent-up adrenaline and fury. He lunged forward, his body a missile of focused intent, and drove the full length of his steel blade into that one vulnerable spot. The resistance was immense, like plunging a knife into a thick rubber tire, but he pushed with every ounce of strength he had left, channeling all of his will into that single desperate motion. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The python's body went rigid, a massive electric shock running through its entire length. The pressure around the cow's neck vanished in a single explosive moment as the coils unwound with convulsive force. The snake's immense frame thrashed wildly one last time, a catastrophic, uncontrolled spasm that threw dirt and grass into the air. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The colossal body fell limp, a dead weight collapsing onto the scorched earth. A deep, profound silence fell over the clearing, a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. The dust began to settle slowly in the slanted afternoon light. The men stood frozen, their chests heaving, their eyes fixed on the still form of the mother cow, now free but utterly motionless on the ground. The only sound was the wind and the unanswered question that hung in the air. The sudden stillness was heavier than the fight that preceded it. A fine, pale dust, kicked up by the violent struggle, settled slowly in the slanted afternoon light, coating everything in a layer of muted gray. The air, thick with the coppery scent of fear and exertion, hung motionless. The men stood a few paces back, their chests heaving, their faces caked in a mixture of sweat and dirt. Their adrenaline receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Before them lay a tableau of survival. The immense, inert body of the python, a dark and silent monument to the chaos, and the mother cow, still and trembling on the scorched earth. Her breath was a shallow, ragged whistle, a fragile sound in the vast, oppressive quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath with them, waiting for the final verdict on the life they had fought so hard to reclaim from the edge of oblivion. Rick moved first, his steps slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the explosive energy of moments before. He holstered his knife, the soft click of steel on leather the only sound to break the silence. With his hands empty and visible, he approached the fallen animal, not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. He knelt in the dry, cracked dirt beside her head, the ground still warm from the sun and the recent struggle. Leaning in close, he spoke, his voice low and steady, a gentle murmur meant not for his men, but for her alone. The words were simple, meaningless sounds of comfort that were carried away by the light breeze, a quiet offering of peace after so much violence. The cow's large, dark eye, no longer wide with panic, watched him with a weary and assessing calm, a silent acknowledgement of the presence that had shifted from threat to protector. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a small movement caught the eye. The calf, which had been a frozen statue of terror, took a hesitant step forward, then another, its spindly legs still trembling. Drawn by a force older than fear, it slowly closed the distance to its mother, a small, hopeful shape against the harsh landscape. It reached her side and nudged her face with its wet nose, its small, rough tongue beginning to lick away the grime and sweat from her cheek. In that single, instinctual gesture, the brutal violence of the day dissolved, replaced by an act of profound and simple tenderness. Rick watched, his own exhaustion mirrored in the mother's gaze, as their eyes met over the head of the calf. There was a shared understanding in that look, a silent recognition of survival, of a debt that could never be spoken, only felt in the quiet rhythm of their breathing. The minutes stretched on, suspended in a fragile limbo of tenderness and depletion. The sun beat down, the wind whispered through the grass, and the men weeded, their own fatigue a heavy weight. The world was still, poised between a tragic end and a new beginning. Then, a ripple of movement. A deep tremor ran through the cow's massive frame as she summoned a reserve of strength from somewhere deep within. With a monumental effort that seemed to take all the life she had left, she shifted her heavy head, turning it slowly toward the insistent nudging of her child. A sound built in her throat, a low, hoarse rattle that struggled for air. It broke from her in a ragged, painful moo, a sound so weak it was almost lost to the wind. But it was an answer. It was a promise. It was the first, fragile note of hope returning to the silent field. Urged on by the persistent nudging of her calf, the mother cow began the slow, arduous process of rising. It was a monumental effort, a battle waged against gravity and the deep cellular memory of the trauma her body had just endured. Her legs, trembling and unsteady, fought for purchase on the dry, unforgiving earth. She faltered once, a heavy sag that seemed to signal defeat, but the small, insistent pressure of her child's head against her flank was a silent command to continue. The men watched from a respectful distance, their own bodies still humming with the ghost of the fight, their presence now a quiet vigil rather than an intervention. They gave her space, understanding that this final act of recovery was a ritual that belonged only to mother and child. With a final, groaning heave, she was on her feet, a towering, exhausted silhouette against the slowly descending sun, the natural order painstakingly restoring itself. They turned and walked back toward the truck, their heavy boots leaving deep impressions in the cooling dust. The oppressive, suffocating heat of the afternoon had finally broken, giving way to a gentle breeze that carried the familiar, distant sounds of the ranch, the lowing of other cattle, the metallic clank of a gate, the simple hum of a world returning to its normal rhythm. The landscape itself seemed to exhale, the harsh, bleached light softening into warm hues of orange and deep purple as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The tall grass, once a witness to a brutal struggle, now swayed peacefully, its whispers carrying a sense of release. What had been a battlefield only an hour ago was once again just a field, a patch of earth reclaimed by the quiet, resilient pulse of life. The air was clean again, scrubbed of the metallic tang of fear, leaving only the scent of dry earth and approaching dusk. Inside the cab of the truck, the silence was different this time. It was not the tense, coiled quiet of the journey out, but a shared, contemplative stillness born of profound exhaustion and a deep, unspoken relief. Rick felt the solid weight of the knife still resting on his hip, a cold, heavy reminder of the violence he had been forced to commit. Yet, counterbalancing that weight was a strange and unfamiliar lightness in his chest, a sense of space where the dread had been. He glanced at his men, their faces streaked with grime, but their eyes clear, reflecting the fading light of the sky.
They had shared something out there in the dust, a moment that went beyond training or duty, forging a bond that needed no words. He turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, a low, steady sound that was a promise of return, of leaving the violence behind in the growing shadows. As the truck began to roll forward, a sound cut through the evening air, clear and strong, echoing across the vast open plain. It was a moo, deep and resonant, not the thin, reedy cry of pain they had heard before, but a powerful, declarative call of life. It was an affirmation, a sound of a mother reassuring her child, a note of profound resilience that seemed to hang in the twilight. Rick paused, his hand on the gear shift, and listened as it faded into the gentle whisper of the wind. That sound was his reward, a payment more valuable than any commendation. It was the sound of a life that had been pulled back from the brink, an echo of a choice made in the dust and the heat. It was a sound he knew would follow him on the long, quiet drive home, a permanent resonance in the silent spaces of his memory. The night that followed was a vast and silent ocean, and he was adrift in it, unable to find the shore of sleep. He lay awake, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the world outside his window, a world that had returned to its ancient and indifferent peace. The stars were sharp and brilliant in the clear, cool air, a million cold points of light that seemed to watch over the darkened landscape with a profound and unblinking stillness. The memory of the day was not a thought, but a physical sensation, a phantom weight in his muscles, the ghost of adrenaline still humming in his veins. He could feel the sun on his skin, smell the dust and the fear, and hear the thin, desperate cry of the calf echoing in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. The images replayed themselves behind his closed eyes, a silent film of violence and tenderness, a story that had burned itself permanently into his memory. He rose and walked to the window, looking out over the fields that were now bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the moon. The ranch was no longer just a collection of fences and fields, a place defined by work and routine. It had become something more, a sacred ground, where the veil between his world and the wild had been torn open. He understood now that what they had witnessed was a primordial drama, a cycle of life and death that plays out 1,000 times a day, unseen and unheard by human eyes. They had not just intervened, they had trespassed, stepping into a story that was not their own and rewriting its ending. The legacy of their actions was not in a report filed or a job well done, but in the reverent silence that now filled him, a deep and humbling awareness of the fragile, brutal beauty of the world he had sworn to protect. He thought of the mother cow and her calf, somewhere out there in the darkness, their shared breaths rising as small clouds in the cool night air. The rescue had not been about saving a piece of livestock or proving their own strength. It had been an answer to a call, a response to a moment of profound suffering that they could not ignore. In that sun-scorched field, faced with the raw, unthinking power of nature, they had chosen compassion over indifference, action over observation. He realized that the truest measure of a person is found not in the battles they win, but in the lives they refuse to abandon. The day had left a mark on him, not a scar on the skin, but an invisible and indelible imprint on his soul, a quiet understanding that would forever change the way he walked through the world. The first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, a soft, gray light that slowly pushed back the darkness. The familiar sounds of the morning began to rise, the distant call of a bird, the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall grass, the world awakening to a new day. He watched as the landscape was reborn in the pale light, the same field, the same sky, but seen now through different eyes. The violence was gone, washed away by the night, leaving only the quiet pulse of life beating steadily on. He knew that out there in the vastness of the wild, life and death would continue their eternal dance, indifferent to his presence. But in nature, every life saved is also a way of saving a part of yourself.